In this lesson, we're going to start our deep dive into Mars. All right. And really, when you start with Mars, you got to go all the way back. So the name itself of Mars is named after, right, the Roman god of war. But what's interesting to note is that Rome, right? So it's all these ancient cultures, right? The Greeks, the Romans, the Babylonians, all different times, different places in human history, and they all had their own mythology, right, with their own set of gods to explain various natural phenomena. So what's amazing, though, is that many of these different civilizations had a god representing war, and in more than one of them, they used that god of war to represent the planet Mars, right? Which is kind of interesting. And of course, we can speculate as to why that might be. But let's just take a look at these gods just for fun. So for the ancient Babylonians, which is probably the first reference we'll look at here, we have the god of war actually on the left as this crazy winged, like, dragon-like thing, which is the god representing chaos, which makes sense. Chaos and war kind of go hand in hand. This was the god named Nergal, all right, and that was their name for the planet Mars. Of course, Mars for the Romans looked more human-like. This is a statue of the Roman god of war, Mars. And then for the Greeks, the name of their god of war was Ares. Okay, and that's another name that was given to Mars. So why would they have all these in common? Well, Mars, if you look at it and see it at night, which I highly recommend doing, especially as you're a part of this astronomy class, when you see it in the night sky, it looks like a star, but it looks like a bright red star. All right, and so naturally, when you see this bright red star in the sky, you think of blood and you think of war, and so you would name it after your god of war, naturally. In fact, it's kind of interesting. Here's an example. The god of war was often pulled in this chariot. For the Romans, the chariot was pulled. Let me see if it has it here. The chariot was pulled by two horses, Phobos and Deimos. So when it was discovered that Mars in fact has two moons, those were natural names for the two moons of Mars, Phobos and Deimos. As we come to more modern times, there's a lot of still myth and legend surrounding Mars, right? And this is, when I say more recent, I mean up until the 18 and 1900s. Now, a lot of that goes back to some very early observations of Mars through the telescope by a scientist named Schiaparelli. And Schiaparelli had this idea that he was just stuck on, which was, perhaps reinforced by his observations, but as near as we can tell was more driven by his ideas, and he kind of made his observations fit. And that was the idea of canals on Mars. So he had access to a very nice telescope, but Mars was still a very fuzzy object to see through his telescope. And so he says he saw these lines, right, throughout the surface of Mars, which he interpreted as canals, like channels made for the flow of water or transportation between presumably cities, or maybe to irrigate large swaths of farmland on Mars. Right? So naturally, this was interpreted as a sign of intelligence. There must be intelligent creatures living on Mars. And so here are some of the early drawings attributed to Schiaparelli, which show these canals connecting the highlands, the lowlands, cities to farmlands, bodies of water to where they live. Okay, this is kind of how it was interpreted. Here's kind of a nice illustration which shows some of those canal drawings mapped onto what we have our more recent pictures through the Hubble Space Telescope of the surface of Mars. And it's difficult to see the connection. I guess that's where you land. You do see the dark regions, which you can see why that would be interpreted as like bodies of water, but it's difficult to see these so-called canals. Some people have even speculated that maybe it was artifacts on his telescope, lines that were somehow on the mirror lenses of his telescope, because they were not observed at other places. Now, it wasn't just Schiaparelli, though. More later on, respected scientist Percival Lowell, who had access to one of the best telescopes in the world, also made strong statements about his observations of seeing canals and even changes on the surface of Mars, right? That would be attributed to living creatures. So this is actually like newspaper clippings. That's what I have here, right? Just to show the kinds of things that were being said in the newspaper. This wasn't just like super fringe stuff. This was stuff that like kind of people on the street considered kind of common knowledge, right? So Professor Percival Lowell, recognized as the greatest authority on the subject, declares there can be no doubt that living beings inhabit our neighbor world. Okay, I mean, these are strong statements being made from real scientists, right? These are scientists using, again, the best telescopes available at the time. And then check this out. Martians build 2 immense canals in 2 years. Another newspaper clipping. Vast engineering works accomplished in an incredibly short time by our planetary neighbors. Wonders of the September sky. So you see a new canal. And look at these before and after drawings, right? You have a drawing on the left, a drawing on the right, and there's new canals. So these must be vastly superior intelligent creatures who are able to do engineering feats beyond anything we could ever do on Earth. Where it gets a little crazy for me, and I should fact check this a little better because it just seems too crazy, but it says here from the Salt Lake Tribune, Mars is peopled by one vast thinking vegetable. All right, now we're getting a little ridiculous, but I think this was a legit newspaper clipping, I think. But the motivation in this case would be that those dark regions were, later on, scientists thought that perhaps it was this huge area of vegetation. So if you're thinking, okay, there is a huge vegetation, there are canals, it must be some kind of thinking vegetable that's very, very large. So it was getting a little ridiculous, I think it's fair to say. But again, I want to emphasize, this was considered kind of like common knowledge. So here's an ad from Kirk's soap, all right? And it says, Mars is peopled, and they want Kirk's American Family soap, right? And you'll notice that this is, I think, a picture of that must be a scientist. He's looking through the Yerkes Observatory, the $500,000 telescope, right? This is a high-quality telescope, and he's making this observation about Mars. The Yerkes Observatory, by the way, is in Wisconsin. I've been there, and it is quite a marvelous telescope. You can actually see it in these newspaper clippings here. This is the telescope. The Yerkes Observatory. It's actually the largest refracting telescope in the world. Here's just a picture. Yerkes. Because when are you going to see a picture of the Yerkes telescope? Here it is today. Here it is 100 years ago with a bunch of famous scientists, and it looks exactly the same now as it did then. Okay, now, of course, we now know, and we'll talk about this more later, that this life is not actually intelligent life. There are no canals on Mars, but that didn't stop our mythologizing about the planet Mars and the potential life that might be there. And one great example of that is the work of fiction by H.G. Wells. This is the late 1800s, called War of the Worlds, where Martians, these crazy Martian spacecraft, come to Earth and essentially just start destroying everything, which is a plot you might be familiar with from most modern science fiction movies. Now, War of the Worlds, that phrase is a title of more than just this book, right? So just to confuse students everywhere, the book was written by H.G. Wells, but in the 1920s, 30s, a radio and filmmaker named Orson Welles created a radio broadcast kind of inspired by this book. And that radio broadcast is legendary, and it's about Mars. Excuse me. The radio broadcast, what made it so legendary was it was almost like this first case of fake reality fiction kind of thing, right? You think about in terms of movies, I remember the first movie I saw like this was called The Blair Witch Project, where they made it with like a bouncy camera and they tried to make it look like it was a homemade movie, but it was like a horror movie, I guess. Okay, so you can imagine movies like that, which are more common now, where you make something and try to make it look as realistic as possible, but it's actually a fictional story. right? And so that's what they did with this radio broadcast. And it was just like ingenious because the radio, I'll play a part of it for you and then I'll interrupt it to kind of explain what's going on. So the radio broadcast, here's the start. I'll play it for you.
Yet across an immense ethereal gulf, minds that are to our minds as ours are to the beasts in the jungle, intellects vast, cool, and unsympathetic, regarded this earth with envious eyes and slowly and surely drew their plans against us. In the 39th year of the 20th century came the Great Disillusionment. It was near the end of October. Business was better. The war scare was over. More men were back at work. Sales were picking up. On this particular evening, October 30th, the Crosley service estimated that 32 million people were listening in on radios.
Okay, now that was the intro to this program. All right, so it was like those were kind of like lines from the book. You know, there's this vast, superior intellect on this planet looking at Earth with envious eyes. Life is good, and 38 million people are listening to the radio. And what it does right there is it fades into a radio broadcast. Okay? Now, imagine that you didn't just hear that. Now, this was on a time when this set of like performers would always do this radio broadcast show, so people knew it was like a fictionalized thing. But imagine you just turn in the dial, okay, and then you land on this station now, right after it's faded into just a normal radio broadcast.
Much change in temperature. A slight atmospheric disturbance of undetermined origin is reported over Nova Scotia, causing a low-pressure area to move down rather rapidly over the northeastern
So we've got a weather report.
bringing a forecast of rain accompanied by wind of light gale force. Maximum temperature 66, minimum 48. This weather report comes to you from the Government Weather Bureau. We take you now to the Meridian Room in the Hotel Park Plaza in downtown New York, where you will be entertained by the music of Raymond Raquello and his orchestra.
All right, so it's Saturday night. You're turning the radio station. This is before TV. And you hear some music. You're like, oh, let's just listen to this station. Oh, this is nice. And you have no idea what you're listening to. It's just some music.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. From the Meridian Room in the Park Plaza Hotel in New York City, we bring you the music of Raymond Raquello and his orchestra. With a touch of the Spanish, Raymond Raquello leads off with La Comparsita.
Oh, this is nice. You get out your newspaper. You're just listening. Like, you know, turn it down a little bit. It's just down in the background. Well, this is nice. I don't know how long this goes on here.
Ladies and gentlemen, we interrupt our program of dance music to bring
turn
you
it
a
up.
special bulletin from the Intercontinental Radio News. At 20 minutes before 8 Central Time, Professor Farrell of the Mount Jennings Observatory, Chicago, Illinois, reports observing several explosions of incandescent gas occurring at regular intervals on the planet Mars. The spectroscope indicates the gas to be hydrogen and moving toward the Earth with enormous velocity. Professor Pearson of the observatory at Princeton confirms Farrell's observation and describes the phenomenon as, quote, like a jet of blue flame shot from a gun, unquote. We now return you to the music of Raymond Raquello, playing for you in the Meridian Room of the Park Plaza Hotel, situated in downtown New York.
Huh, that was weird. Alright, so you're listening to the music again, and you're like, that was weird. There was these, you know, flames on Mars that were like high velocity. Okay, so you're thinking that's a legit like interruption of the news, right? Is the idea. Right, and this whole broadcast continues like this, where there's these interruptions of news, these updates that are telling a scary story.
Never loses favor. The ever-popular Stardust, Raymond Raquello and his orchestra.
All right, so another song begins, and let's just see if there's. Well, you know, I might skip ahead and just see if there's one more interruption.
The village of Grover's Mill. Their bodies burned and distorted beyond all possible recognition.
Oh dear.
The next voice you hear will be that of Brigadier General Montgomery Smith, commander of the state militia at Trenton, New Jersey.
I have been requested by the governor of New Jersey to place the counties of Mercer and Middlesex as far west as Princeton and east to Jamesburg under martial law. No one will be permitted to enter this area except by special pass issued by state or military authorities. 4 companies of state militia are proceeding from...
Imagine you're actually hearing this and like you think there's a chance it might be real. Now keep in mind this is 1938. I know people are talking kind of like in formal voices, but that's what the radio sounded like. And it wasn't that long before this, 20 years, that you're seeing newspaper clippings that are indicating like it's inevitable that there's living creatures on Mars. So as you get to the end of this, right, and the story of the War of Worlds is not really a great one. Let's listen to another
same
spot.
emotion. The joy of finding another living being.
That's near Grover's Mill.
Yes.
Grover's Mill.
All right. It can go on and on. The point is that for some people it actually scared them quite significantly, because people thought it was real, right? They thought this was a legit alien invasion that was taking place. And as you saw in the middle clip, like people were being killed and all kinds of bad things were happening. So that's what makes this really like the most legendary radio broadcast of all time, because it was interpreted as a very realistic and plausible possibility. So what? Crazy. War of the Worlds. The point of all this, I think you're seeing, is that Mars continues, right? We see this legacy. We talk about the exploration of Mars. There was the face on Mars, right? Where people in early imagery thought they could see like a face on the planet, right? Here's the famous picture of the face on Mars from the early spacecraft. Like, it's this giant face. It must have been like a huge statue that fell and there was a civilization there, right? Of course, it ended up being just the shadows. So more recent photographs showed that there was this crazy mound. But this is what's kind of like fueled this history of all of this from ancient mythology all the way to more recent events. And even up through movies, right? So think about, these are all movies about Mars. I showed you The Martian. You've got really an enormous list from, Mars Attacks was this crazy, goofy movie by Tim Burton. Mars Needs Moms. Robinson Crusoe on Mars. Santa Claus Conquers the Martians. Okay, so you've got an enormous number of movies that have been made about Mars. So this continues to be a part of our psyche, right? So when we talk about the exploration of Mars, when we talk about scientific or otherwise, we have to remember like this legacy of what would you say? This legacy of Mars has been close to our hearts for like a really, really long time. Okay, cool. So good stuff. I hope you enjoyed that. If you want to learn more about War of the Worlds, it's like a crazy broadcast. The book is enjoyable. There's, of course, movies that have been made about it. All of that is worth digging into more. But that's it for now, and I will see you next time.